Today we will talk about the problem of other minds. Are other people conscious, or are you the only entity who is conscious in the entirety of existence? Many people have tried to solve this problem. It is an ancient problem. And, well, there are two important solutions that people have proposed. On the one hand, you have the Turing Test, something that Alan Turing proposed to test whether computers could be conscious and intelligent. The way that he proposed is to have the computer interact with you verbally. And if the computer is indistinguishable from a human who is also interacting with you, then you can say the computer is as conscious as it can be. Well, this is actually kind of a problematic approach. A very obvious counterexample is dream characters. I mean, I am interested in knowing whether my dream characters are conscious on their own. However, if I perform a Turing test on them, I might get all of the answers. I mean, the person I'm interacting with may be able to really provide a very, very interesting and detailed account and talk about consciousness and so on, but it could really just be a reflection of my own mind. Like, I am actually thinking for that entity. So the Turing test has one and actually quite a few counterexamples that make it something that I don't think actually works. The second approach is, in a sense, a lot more direct. The idea is to connect two brains to each other with something that here we will call a phenomenal bridge. Basically, you interconnect, for example, the center of both brains, the thalamus, the most important routing system and nodal point in the brain. And once you connect them, maybe you train them and you synchronize them, and ideally they would become one unified consciousness. So the test would be as follows. I am uncertain whether my friend is conscious or not. I connect my brain to him, and then if my consciousness becomes expanded, if it seems now like I actually have more qualia overall, I have two visual fields, I have two body sensations, I have the capacity to experience two mouths at once, and so on, then that should be proof that actually the other entity is conscious. And hey, I think that would be very strong evidence. However, some critics have pointed out that that's flawed. It doesn't really solve the problem. In particular, Tomasik and Eliezer Yudkowsky have commented that the problem with this is that you don't know whether the other entity is simply upgrading your hardware, so to speak. If your brain has perhaps like a module that is critical for consciousness and the other brain doesn't, say, it might be that when you interconnect with that other brain, the only thing that is happening is that you're increasing the overall amount of, say, like cortex or some other component that may not be actually the seed of consciousness or may not be the thing that is crucial, but it can definitely enhance your consciousness. So if your consciousness expands, you don't know whether that was just hardware update. You don't know whether the other entity was conscious before you did that. And you don't know whether it will remain conscious after you disconnect. So that is another problem. How do we actually overcome these two problems? Well, I propose a solution. The solution is outlined in two essays I have in Qualia Computing called A Workable Solution to the Problem of Other Minds and Phenomenal Puzzles. Before I go through the solution, let's just talk very briefly about why it would be so revolutionary to actually have one. Well, as we saw, the two tests that have been proposed don't really work. So most people kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, at least we can rely on some probabilistic argument. We are all evolutionarily connected and our brains are extremely similar in many ways. And if we assume physicalism as well as Occam's razor, then it does seem like very likely that other entities are just conscious. I mean, especially if you do believe that the reason your body is the way it is for evolutionary reasons, then yes, evolution selected consciousness and everybody around you is. But some people are still disconcerted. They don't really believe in an evolutionary argument for a deep philosophical problem. Solipsism is the idea that you are the only subject of experience in the entirety of existence. It is worth noting that actually there are some implicit background assumptions that you need to specify in order to get at a precise definition of your kind of solipsism, in case you're one. Because, in some sense, some people, for example, define who they are as the entity that starts existing when they're born and stops existing when they die. And that solipsism is a very particular kind of it. And another stronger version of it is whether you are only this present moment and that's it. And you would be skeptical of even the continuity of time and the continuity of self. And there's like many other brands of solipsism you can come up with. But the typical one, the one that most people are usually concerned of, is when they do identify with their own timeline, basically their own narrative. They do believe that they can survive from moment to moment, that is the entity that exists, and they are skeptical that other people have conscious experiences, as well as animals, and potentially that it might be impossible to create a machine, a quantum or not, or in whatever medium it's made, that is conscious, because the only consciousness is actually you in this narrative form. And that is the one that this particular experiment can address. So if you do have sort of that concern, then this is at least a door into the possibility of ruling it out for sure. I mean, and if somebody comes up to me and says, I'm concerned about solipsism, I mean, I think that's fair. Like, it's kind of freaky not to have a, strong and obvious demonstration that solipsism is just not true. I was very concerned about it when I was 5, when I first thought about, hey, what if other people are robots that are not conscious? And I'd get concerned about it when I meditate. And yeah, I mean, altered states of consciousness usually make people prone to be concerned about solipsism. And when I wrote about the problem of other minds, I did it in part because it's a philosophically fascinating idea and problem, but also because it seems that actually quite a few people are genuinely emotionally concerned about it. You have solipsism that is actually something that has plagued the minds of people for ages, and even though nowadays we kind of marginalize the idea and we try not to think about it too much, or alternatively we just convince ourselves we've got a really good solution for it. At best it's probabilistic, but there are people who are very, very concerned about it, and some people actually contacted me asking to see whether I could help them perform the experiment so that they can test each other's consciousness and see whether they are, in a sense, alone in the universe. The person who contacted me is Link, and he was basically concerned about whether one of his best friends was actually conscious. That's not something that everybody thinks about all the time, but hear his story. What happened is that he was walking in a forest, and in the forest he found his friend Leona. And Leona became really good friends with Link. They started going on adventures together, saving princesses and solving all kinds of puzzles. However, later on, Link realized that Leona doesn't even have DNA. She's made of an entirely different substance unknown to science, and he got kind of concerned. I mean, it's not every day that you get to hang out with somebody who, well, not only doesn't resemble you, but it's not evolutionarily related to you in any way. Leona happens to be a super intelligent little cat and, well, something, but she is pretty sure that she herself is conscious and experiences reality uh, in, in a true way, that it's not just an automata, that there's somebody inside of her. But Link, unfortunately, is not that sure. I mean, it's kind of freaky to suddenly interact with somebody made of something entirely different. So Link contacted me to see whether we could perform the experiment uh, and allow them to basically convince each other of their actual existence as conscious beings. So I accepted, and I said to Link, look, we will need the following ingredients. Number one, a phenomenal bridge. This is a technology that allows two minds to merge with each other. And I don't mean just to share information like in a very fast conversation. I mean it in a very fundamental sense, like actually two consciousness becoming one. We already have like potentially an example of that, but in reverse, with split brain patients who, when their corpus callosum is cut, there's like some substantial evidence, although it's controversial, that what may be going on there is actually the consciousness of the person got divided into two independent beings. As an aside, not everybody believes this is what happens, but it's a possibility. We will represent phenomenal bridges with these two items. They're purely symbolic, obviously, because a phenomenal bridge would probably involve actual neurons and complicated wiring. But just imagine that each other's qualia are sort of like being beamed into each other and they're connecting. Number two, we will require a qualia calibrator. So this is an apparatus that basically shuffles through permutations of different values in particular state spaces. So here we have some examples. The state space of color is basically reached by combining different permutations of, in this case, three colors of light, and here as well. And they're beeping so that actually the temporal frequencies by which the overlapping of these different qualia values within the qualia variety of phenomenal color, so that they can, yes, actually span the whole range of frequencies and combinations needed to get the basis of that state space. The qualia calibrator that we would use in the actual experiment is way more general. Here we are only using, as a demonstration, qualia calibrators that use the color state space. And that's okay for now. I mean, the experiment can be conducted only with one qualia variety, such as phenomenal color. But ideally, we would try to actually span all of the qualia varieties that both entities are capable of instantiating in their minds. Third, phenomenal puzzles. A phenomenal puzzle is a puzzle that can only be solved if you're conscious. This is accomplished by solving it only if you're able to compare and contrast different qualia values within a given qualia variety. An example of a phenomenal puzzle is to try to provide a linear mapping of all of the qualia values of the state space of color, such that there is a proper metric in that space. By that I mean that you can take any 2 points in that state space and you can tell me what is the number of just noticeable differences between them, such that the entire state space is actually consistent and is accurate in the sense that the just noticeable differences in that state space do match with the objective just noticeable differences that that qualia variety exhibits. And finally, we will also need the proper set and setting to conduct the experiment in the proper order. So let's see how the experiment actually gets conducted. First of all, they both agreed to conduct the experiment. Then, Link learns a phenomenal puzzle. You know, a problem that you can only solve if you use operations available in your own consciousness. So in this case, what Link will do is choose a phenomenal puzzle that has to do with the qualia variety of color. And Link is actually very happy to do so because he doesn't know very much about color. I mean, he's been so busy saving princesses and solving other kinds of puzzles that he's neglected like psychology entirely in the last, like, what, 10 years? So this little fellow doesn't really know anything about what the state space of color looks like, and actually it might not even be, knowledgeable enough to infer it at first. And that's a precondition. So he has to be ignorant of actually the solution to the phenomenal puzzle for the procedure to work. The second stage is to go with Leona and use the phenomenal bridge in order to connect his consciousness to her consciousness. This is what they look like when they are linked, when they're like interconnected. Now they are sharing the same consciousness. And that's a very strange and peculiar experience. Now that they are linked, they will turn on the qualia calibrator. This way, they will be able to match what the triggered qualia for any given stimuli is in one visual field relative to the other visual field. That way, they can actually say, after they've undergone through the entire process, hey, the blue that I experience is actually, say, the green that you experience. They can now actually make that mapping, so they can develop a new word, say X. And X corresponds to the exact same qualia in both persons. X, for example, may have been the qualia that Link experiences when he sees a blue light, and maybe Leona experiences when she sees a red light. Yeah, the mappings may actually be species specific, and when you're talking about an potentially extraterrestrial being, yeah, who knows actually what combinations of light and what combinations of stimuli trigger what qualia. So with this process, they're able to develop a new vocabulary that they can actually share. And with that, they will be able to explain what the phenomenal puzzle is. They can reference those particular qualia varieties that they have identified with the particular qualia values and say, all right, the qualia puzzle is you have to take X, Y, Z, T different qualias, and you have to order them by dimmer to brighter, for example. The experience of telling the phenomenal puzzle may in some sense be very peculiar, because we're talking about Link's memories of when he heard the phenomenal puzzle, which he himself hasn't solved yet. And now he is recounting the puzzle to himself as this integrated consciousness. However, the brain of Leona doesn't contain that puzzle yet. Therefore, when this entity that is actually the shared consciousness of both, or actually potentially a third consciousness, but that shares both brains, is telling itself, retelling itself something it already knows, because it can find it in one of its brains, so that the other brain can have copies of it and records of it. In that way, when they actually become disconnected, we will still have in Leona's brain the actual specifications of the phenomenal puzzle, not in terms of some external vocabulary that may not necessarily refer to the qualia values that we care about, but actually specified in terms of the qualia values that Link can experience. This way, when Leona goes off and tries to figure out how to order the various qualia varieties and qualia values in some coherent way, such as from brighter to dimmer, or actually infer the state space of a particular qualia variety, such as the 3 dimensions in phenomenal color. When she tries to do that, we know that actually she is working with a qualia that Link was interested in to begin with, the one that the phenomenal puzzle was about. Then we actually sedate Link. That's a very important part of the step, because in this way we can guarantee that there's like no qualia computing, no interesting computation going on in Link's part of the story, while Leona is trying to attempt it. Now, Leona is probably required to be, in a sense, super intelligent, or at least like very, very competent. This test is definitely not for figuring out whether arbitrary entities are conscious. It's a test to determine whether a entity is conscious that the entity itself is very intelligent and conscious. In other words, it doesn't really solve, in the general sense, the problem of solipsism as I specified it earlier. However, it does solve a very particular branch, which is the one that people are the most concerned of. If Leona is able to solve the problem, say, hey, I was able to put all of these colors in a state space derived by the just noticeable differences between the qualia that I can distinguish. And for example, in the case of color is this Euclidean 3D space, she will be able to recount that solution once we link back with a phenomenal bridge. In this sense, again, the experience must be pretty strange. You have these interconnected, unified subject of experience that arises out of the activity of both brains at the same time, and it's sort of like telling the solution to itself. From the memory is in one of the brains, so that by exposing it to the entire entity, now records of the solution actually end up in Link's brain. Now, we finally disconnect it, and Link is asked what the solution to the phenomenal puzzle is. If he is able to provide the answer, then that means that Leona was doing qualia computing when Link was sedated. In other words, Leona was doing something that you can only actually achieve if you're able to compare systematically the subjective distance between different qualia values in a particular state space. In other words, qualia must have been conscious. She must have had access to those particular qualia values. It must have been able to put them side by side and say, oh, these ones are way more different than these other ones. Now, why wouldn't you be able to do this with a non-sentient or an unconscious superintelligence? Maybe Link is only more conscious now because he got, in a sense, a hardware improvement. Leona maybe was never conscious, but by connecting with Link, the brain in its totality is capable of more. Especially if you have a computationalist account of consciousness, this seems plausible. Which means that just connecting with another entity and expanding your consciousness is not enough to say that that entity was conscious when you were not connected to it. Which is what the phenomenal puzzle is actually attempting, and I think solving, because you can only actually solve the puzzle if you're doing something computationally useful using qualia operations that take as their input the particular values that were assigned during the connection. And that, my friends, is how you test the existence of other minds. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, a recording of when Link tested Leona's consciousness.